It is time for us to realize that we are too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. We are not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. So, with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams. You are listening to Filthy Armenian Adventures.
Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies above. Don't fence me in. Let me ride through the wide open country that I love. Don't fence me in. Let me be by myself in the evening breeze. Listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me off forever, but I ask you please, don't fence me in. Just turn me loose, let me saddle my old saddle underneath the western sky. On my cayuse, let me wander over yonder till I see the mountains high. I want to ride to the ridge where the west commences. Gaze at the moon till I lose my senses. Can't stand hobbles and I can't stand fences. Don't fence me in.
Are there good people in politics? The answer may surprise you. My hatred of Washington, D.C. is no secret. I don't keep it in a locket in my bosom next to a picture of my dead husband. I say it out loud. D.C. is a bourgeois town. In addition to loudly despising Washington, D.C., I also quietly hold it in my seething contempt, and not just out of libertarian principle, but out of personal experience. I spent 1 year of my life in the District of Columbia, reporting on Congress for an internship with Roll Call. I got to see the likes of Chuck Schumer, Barney Frank, and David Petraeus in action. I attended supposedly like-minded happy hours where future star journalists David Weigel, Ezra Klein, Tyler Cohen, and Megan McArdle held court. I shared an elevator once with Madeleine Albright, and later as an editorial intern at Washingtonian Magazine, I got exposed to the even grimmer lifestyle side of our nation's capital. The few people I encountered who had souls were living in professional straitjackets. 2007 to 2008, the darkest year of my life, because it was spent in Washington, D.C. But if you're trapped in hell for any length of time, there is a certain kind of person that you just can't help but notice. A good person. There are somehow good people to be found in hell. Today, we are going to meet one of them. Ken Khachigian grew up on a farm in Visalia, California, a town near Fresno where many survivors of the Armenian genocide arrived circa 1915. Central Valley farm boys of Ken's generation grew up on sports, competition, grapes, and Goldwater. Most of them went into business, but Ken's spirits led him along the student body president path, which didn't diverge all that much from sports and business in those days, as indicated by the name of the prestigious program he was selected for in high school. It is called Boys State. Boys State. Boys State And Boys Nation, established 1935, was the American Legion's answer to a leftist version of the same kind of politician grooming program called Young Pioneer Camps. Boy State produced Bill Clinton, Roger Ebert, NFL wide receiver Hines Ward, Mike Huckabee, James Carville, Lou Dobbs, Sam Alito, NFL owner Stan Kroenke, Tom Cotton, Rush Limbaugh, NBA coach Phil Jackson, NBA star Michael Jordan, Chris Christie, Bon Jovi, Bruce Springsteen, James Gandolfini, Troy Aikman, Tom Brokaw, Nick Saban, even somehow Al Jarreau. And it also produced my guest today, Ken Khachigian. While attending Columbia Law School after graduating from UC Santa Barbara, Ken was hired in 1968 to work for Richard Nixon, a fellow Californian who had announced his first presidential campaign from Knott's Berry Farm. That campaign had lost at the buzzer after several very fishy calls. But in 1968, with the help of Ken and the man who hired him, Pat Buchanan, and Alan Greenspan and many others, Nixon completed the greatest comeback in American political history. Cemented by his landslide re-election in 1972, and crowned by a foreign policy that achieved peace with China and an end to the Vietnam War. Those achievements were celebrated by the deep throats in Washington in the form of a coup that forever confused the American public as to who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in the swamp. The lower Nixon sank from Watergate, the more he clung for support to a young aide who would acquire two nicknames in his career. One was Menian, for obvious reasons. The other, given to him by Pat Buchanan, was Onoda, after the Japanese general who never stopped fighting the Second World War. In the final days of Nixon's presidency, only one voice was left urging him to fight his impeachment and not to resign. That voice was Onoda's. The story is told in a new memoir called Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Nixon and Reagan. But the story doesn't end with Nixon's disgrace. After the resignation, Ken Khachigian followed Nixon back to San Clemente, where they would work closely together on Nixon's memoirs and in preparation for the historic interview with David Frost, an extremely dramatic ordeal where Nixon was expected to answer to history and confess.
I'm sorry. I just hope I haven't let you down. Well, when I said, I just hope I haven't let you down, that said it all. I had. I let down my friends. I let down the country. I let down our system of government and the dreams of all those young people that ought to get into government but will think it's all too corrupt and the rest. Most of all, I let down an opportunity that I would have had for 2.5 more years to proceed on great projects and programs for building a lasting peace, which has been my dream, as you know, from our first interview in 1968, before I had any thought I might even win that year. I didn't tell you I didn't think I might win, but I wasn't sure. Yep, I let the American people down. And I have to carry that burden with me for the rest of my life.
He just wanted the world to stop killing itself. By any algorithm, Ken Khachigian should have been a lifelong Washington man. But a city that venerated Woodward and Bernstein and their conspirators was not a place where he wanted to live. He never moved back. He stayed in California for good. He would become quote, the state's premier Republican strategist and wordsmith, end quote, in the words of Bob Novak, D.C.'s premier and perhaps only smart and honest reporter. But even though Ken was done with Washington, Washington was far from done with California. In 1980, Ken accepted an offer to be the chief speechwriter for the struggling campaign of Ronald Reagan.
Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you'll vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have.
In Behind Closed Doors, we get the play-by-play on the 1980 campaign, the 1984 re-election campaign, and many other decisive scenes in Reagan's presidency that depended on Ken's typewriter, which became a kind of trusted shield between Reagan's pro-liberty convictions and the power-dealing motives of his more Washington-oriented staff, led by Jim Baker. Those scenes included the assassination attempt and survival and the first speech that followed it, the fights over tax cuts in the first term, Reagan's extremely controversial visit to Bitburg and the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany, Iran-Contra backstabbings, and the conjugal conflict with Nancy over how to frame Reagan's final farewell. Scores are settled in this book. Records are set straight in a straightforward, modest, objective manner that involves little psychologizing or mind-reading. By their own actions, certain characters are revealed, and villainies of the swamp, which Ken made sure never to return to, emerge from every corner. As for my personal convictions, Ken told me, I viewed them from the standpoint of individualism, and while being part of a team to carry out the goals of the president, not needing to bend philosophically to win friends that I knew would never be permanent. Friends are seldom permanent in the swamp. Nixon recedes as Reagan takes the reins in Behind Closed Doors, but he never disappears. In fact, a running thread of this book is how Nixon, the old man, became a self-appointed long-distance coach to the Gipper throughout both campaigns and even the presidency, with Ken as the go-between. Memos full of sharp advice and analysis arrived regularly from Nixon's booth in San Clemente to Ken's headset in Air Force One or the White House or in room 1915 of the Century Plaza Hotel. Reproduced in the book, these letters and conversations reveal a man who never stopped being intensely, thoughtfully engaged in the fate of his country and the world. Was Tricky Dick one of the good men after all? I haven't studied him well enough to conclude, but as we see in Behind Closed Doors, he's looking much better every day than the brave hoaxmeisters who dethroned him or the former allies who threw him under the bus for the sake, definitely not of their careers and social standing in Washington, but of democracy. As for the Gipper, there is a tendency in some quarters of the online right to malign him these days. This is partly due to hagiography fatigue, partly a rebellion to the way his legacy is invoked in a never-Trump manner by the very establishment forces that defied and sabotaged him in office. Ken's book exposes many defects of the Reagan administration, to be sure. But it puts any revisionist inklings about the man himself and his performance with history to bed. Reagan had regrets. Reagan made mistakes. He could not, in the end, permanently reverse the role of Washington in our lives. But whenever his back was truly to the wall, see Bitburg, he acted with courage and creativity. And on the most important question of his time, he, so to speak, toppled the Berlin Wall. The ideals of the pioneer West he cherished and embodied, that were dead in the water by 1980, he restored to cultural prominence. He gave the Wild West a second wind. Without Reagan, there is no Rush, and without Rush, America is probably Europe by now. When his country was at a loss, Reagan became its speechwriter and punched it up. And it's no small testament to the purity of his cause that for his own scripts, he came to depend so closely on Onoda. The working relationship that produced so many iconic performances, whereby the craftsmanship of Hollywood and the principles of Visalia usurped the villainies of the swamp, reminds us that the only thing with more power than power is words. You get a feeling reading this book for just how much of history hinges on a mere phrase, a last-second thought, a memory, a sudden sight as the plane hits the runway. You feel the great communicator's pain when one of his cherished anecdotes, which he plans to deploy as a climax, is fact-checked by Ken and staff to have some small inaccuracy which a hostile press would slaughter him for. You rejoice when a solution is found by a clever rhetorical tweet.
Beyond those monuments to heroism is the Potomac River, and on the far shore, the sloping hills of Arlington National Cemetery with its row upon row of simple white markers bearing crosses or stars of David. They add up to only a tiny fraction of the price that has been paid for our freedom. Each one of those markers is a monument to the kind of hero I spoke of earlier. Their lives ended in places called Belleau Wood, the Argonne, Omaha Beach, Salerno, and halfway around the world on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Pork Chop Hill, the Chosin Reservoir, and in 100 rice paddies and jungles of a place called Vietnam. Under one such marker lies a young man, Martin Treptow.
Under one such marker, not literally under one of those markers that the cameras just showed at Arlington Cemetery, because it turned out he was buried somewhere else, but under one such marker. Yes, technically not false. The devil isn't always in the details. You can cheer these workshop solutions because as you read about Reagan's rhetoric and note how effective it was in terms of motivating his own staff, in terms of flipping votes from the opposing party in Congress, and in leapfrogging the swamp to appeal directly to American citizens, you realize that all might be propaganda, but not all propaganda is phony. There is a difference between propaganda that promotes the freedom and glory of man and the other kind that promotes his defeat. That difference, my fellow Americans, is captured in the final 3 words of this interview with Ken Khachigian. 3 words describing a phenomenon that might be less possible than we think in an age of mass, automatic, digital, siloed brainwashing, where at least one half of the country, and we know which half that is, never gets to hear what the other half has to say. A phenomenon that might seem synonymous with brainwashing, but which, in fact, could be the only thing that can stop it. Kind of like a good man in Washington. Hey everyone, it's your host Alec Mohibian with a quick note before we begin. Filthy Armenian Adventures is an interdimensional travel program that takes you deep into the cultural mysteries of our strange and interesting times. In search of truth, in search of gold, in search of lost friends and unsung heroes, in search of John Galt's motor. The show is supported entirely by patrons at patreon.com/filthyarmenian. Patrons get access to twice as many adventures, including the most intimate and scandalous ones, plus regular 5 to 15 minute smoke break mini episodes on movies, shows, and topics of the urgent moment. Patrons also get first dibs on our next live event. The first two were a smash. It's very easy to keep Filthy Armenian Adventures alive. You can still listen to the premium feed on Apple or Spotify or your favorite app, and you can do so with the pride that you're putting a little bit of money where your soul is. More patrons means more landmarks, more hotspots, more secret locations, and forbidden territories around the world, and the world that is Los Angeles, our apocalyptic headquarters. It means we'll be able to track down more enchanting figures in the landscape and dare them to abandon their masks. Patreon.com/filthyarmenian. Gracias for listening, and enjoy the show. So, to start with, it was a bit serendipitous, because as I was reading it, Trump echoed the clinching line in Reagan's 1980 campaign. Mm-hmm. He posted, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?"
Right.
And Reagan, and as you explain, you and Reagan came up with the line, "Are you better off than you were in 1976?"
Yeah.
I believe.
Right.
And that was sort of the clinching. How do you feel about seeing the echo of that particular line 44 years later?
Well, it's become I don't think he's the only one that's ever used it. I mean, now it's become the standard standard in politics. It's one of those. I'm flattered that it's become one of those measurements by which people are in politics are measured. In terms of their past performance. It's used by people in television and commentators and columnists, just by saying candidates are always going to be asked by their opponents, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" So it was a line that sort of popped out of my head. I don't know how it came, where it came. Who knows, Maybe I accidentally plagiarized it from somewhere along the line, and somebody's going to come along and say, that was used in 1924 or something like that. So anyway, I'm not offended by it. It's just I think it's sort of it's gone into the common pool of usage. So I don't think it's. I think it's something that makes sense for anybody in politics to have their opponent measured by.
Well, it's interesting because that to wonder why it's being used, because much like "Make America Great Again," it works.
That I think is. I think people are less likely to remember that was Reagan's line, and people know that this "Are you better off" was used by Reagan in the debate with Jimmy Carter. But the quote MAGA line was first used by Reagan in the 1980. And he may have used it before that. I don't know. I joined Reagan in the fall of 1980, and I wasn't involved in the 1980 convention speech. Now, whether Reagan used that, he may have been using that in the 70s, for all I know. So I don't know if he wrote that or if his other speechwriter, Peter Hannaford, put that in the 80 convention speech. Somebody will have to do the research on that. But I did reinsert it in his 84 convention speech and his 88 convention speech. So it very much became a part of Reagan's persona. And that, I think, is much more the kind of line that people ought to say, well, Trump really did adopt a signature Reagan line and make something out of it that maybe Reagan never intended.
So it's interesting to me because both they're kind of somewhat similar lines. Looking at it philosophically, how and why these certain lines work. Mm-hmm. I mean, both of these lines. I mean, "Make America Great Again" has a musical grandeur to it. It sound rolls right off the tongue, and it evokes a wonderful past. "Are You Better Off Than You Were 4 Years Ago" is far simpler, far more, I guess, localized, and
it's more political.
It's more political, and I wonder why. Usually, things tend to get a little bit better over 4 years just by the general, progress of mankind. Yet, I think most people don't believe that's the case. Otherwise, that line wouldn't work. Now, in the case of Reagan and Carter's administration was a disaster, so it hits hard, and it hits hard now because this administration has been an absolute disaster. But in general, I wonder why that particular, if there's something fundamental about a sense that things are always getting worse, and any kind of reference to it. Have you thought about why that particular line, beyond the fact that it applied accurately to that moment and this moment, is there something fundamental about a line like that makes it stick in your mind?
Well, that's because if people don't feel good about themselves compared to where they were, prior to a few years back, that it's gonna go straight to, it's gonna be like a stake in the heart. And now, if looking back 4 years, and I can say, geez, I'm doing pretty good now, and you can say that to me, and I'll say, well, it really doesn't affect me. But if you're spending a lot of time at Costco, where I've been mainly checking out my hearing aids, and I don't shop there, but I see people going out with massive cartfuls of things.
Yeah.
But I do go to supermarkets shopping for myself when my wife's gone, and I see people taking out coupons at the checkout stand, so they can get 15 cents off on their bread and 10 cents off on their bacon, and 20 cents off on their butter. Then they're obviously thinking to themselves, when somebody says, "Are you better off today than we were 4 years ago?" that line goes right to the heart of their whole life.
I think about how much $20 or let's say $40 at the grocery store would have bought me in 2020 versus what it gets me now. Yeah. If Reagan was around, you might pick a visual grocery cart to compare. How many eggs, how much bacon. It's significantly less now.
It's amazing. Yeah, exactly.
I want to talk a little bit about how you got into this, and then about the tremendous figures that you were so close to for so many years. Mm-hmm. And even this book, Behind Closed Doors, which is a very important historical record. You do a lot of records. You do a lot of setting the record straight in this book. Especially, there's some scores that you settle with.
Well, that's what memoirs are all about. Not all about, but that's one of the things that memoirs are about.
That's some of the most interesting parts of the book, because even from my minimal experience in Washington, D.C. of 9 months, the kinds of characters I know who make a career in D.C., which you basically avoided despite being so close to Nixon and Reagan, you stayed out here and didn't become a full-time
Right,
staff member.
purposely, yes.
Right, purposely, clearly. And it's easy to see why when reading this book. There's endless amounts of backstabbing, of valor stealing, credit stealing.
That's a good way of putting it. Valor stealing is a good word,
Yeah.
Good phrase.
And I feel it very strongly. There's a lot of, there's clearly a lot of moments where injustices occurred behind the scenes, and they seem to not only harm your reputation or your career standing, but also the country. Because it seems like in the case of Ronald Reagan's administration, and I'd like to talk to you about this a little bit in depth, because you keep your analysis in the book very, it's like a cinematic. It's very much about the scene, the particular task at hand, the speech at hand, and the moment. You don't psychoanalyze in the big picture so much, and so I'd like to give you a chance to do so now. Do you feel like, looking back, Ronald Reagan's administration was significantly hampered in his crusade, as he called it, by these policy people and these think tank people, Jim Baker being the head of them all, who weren't on board and who kind of undermined him behind the scenes, administratively and strategically? Do you feel like it was a real deficit to his overall achievements in office?
It hampered it more than to the extent that he really did. He was so excited when he came into office about having the opportunity to make really revolutionary change. You could tell it in the first chapter when he assumed office, in those first few days in the first cabinet meetings that I described, where he was literally excited about all the presentations being made to him, where they were cutting regulations and cutting budgets, and he was just thrilled by the changes. And he came into office here having all this opportunity to put into enactment what he'd been preaching for years and years and years. First on the General Electric circuit, going throughout the country as a spokesman for General Electric, and then as a governor, and then when he was not governor and not able to win the presidency against Ford and then even against a short challenge against Nixon, that he had preached in his radio show and further in traveling across the country. Now finally was this enormous opportunity to come into office and just bring the hammer, this cudgel of change, and then he brought in to surround himself with people that were not in the same category, and he brought in with him someone who he brought in for the purposes of for largely management skills, to bring efficiency into his operation. And that person, as I said in the book, by self-admission said he came he didn't say I didn't come not to serve the president, but he also said I came to wield power. And and then he brought people in with him who didn't share the president's agenda. And so to that extent, there was a slow drip dilution of Reagan's crusade, and there's a very telling interchange he and I had at Camp David in June of 1981, where he paused to say that I don't remember the exact words, but it's based. The thrust of it was that he felt that the fellows around him didn't exactly share the same feelings about their crusade that he did. And then I think finally, as the years went by, he allowed himself to be convinced that it was okay.
What was the shortcoming, do you feel, in that? Trump has been blamed for making the same mistake in his first administration and bringing in too many establishment people who were not on board with his actual agenda and who undermined him and leaked and backstabbed and all the sort of things that are echoed in your memoirs of the 80s, of the Reagan campaign. And in Trump's case, you could say, well, he had no experience in politics. He needed some Washington people to figure things out. But Reagan had a lot of experience in politics. He had experience as a governor. Why do you think he ultimately brought in these people who clearly weren't in favor of his ideological beliefs?
Well, he brought in one,
which is Baker
to manage things, and then he allowed Baker to bring in others that Reagan knew nothing about, about whom Reagan knew nothing, and that was not Reagan's job. And Reagan didn't. Reagan usually had a very vague sense of a lot of the people around him. He didn't become close to people, and if Darman probably saw him several times a day, or spent many hours. Darman inserted himself in a lot of meetings, and Reagan probably thought he was just another piece of meat in terms of
right.
In other words, not literally, but as just another person in the room. He didn't view him as anyone that he had any real bond with or anything else, because he didn't know anything about him. Darman wasn't on the campaign with him. Darman never served with him in the past. Darman never created a connection with him. Darman was cold and indifferent. He had sort of a switchblade smile,
Switchblade smile.
and Gergen was sort of always sort of oily and sort of climbing and always looking to. You could see he was looking to ingratiate himself all the time, but Reagan, never got close to him. I mean, it was just he was just another personage to him. Reagan did get close to Baker, because Baker was there, and Baker was smooth and congenial and knew how to work him. But the people that would help influence things and do leaks and everything else were strangers to him. And so you're asking why he couldn't control the processes, because that was not his job. Nixon, on the other hand, would have been able to see through a lot of that, or at least in his case, Haldeman wouldn't have permitted those people around.
What did Nixon? You have one of the fascinating storylines of the memoir is how Richard Nixon was quietly, secretly coaching, use the word, Reagan through the 80s, sending letters often through you,
right? Because
you're so close to Richard Nixon, and I want to talk about that at some point too. This is maybe a good segue. He was coaching Reagan. He was very engaged with what was happening, and he just seems like out of a will to be helpful.
Yeah, he wanted to do it. Yeah,
and you reproduce a lot of the letters in the appendix of the book.
Yeah.
Which are quite interesting. He has a lot of very funny lines that he was trying to.
Well, he was frustrated. He had all this built-up frustration over the years where he could not participate in politics. And now, after all these years, after 6 years of being out of the arena, now he had me. For the first time, he had a intermediary
that
he could reliably communicate with the candidate. And even if it was surreptitiously.
What did he think of? Because I don't recall him precisely address. Maybe because you didn't share at the time your frustrations with what was happening behind closed doors. How did he view the sense that Reagan was being sabotaged and sent by his own people, basically?
I think he viewed that more in terms of foreign policy later on, in terms of dealing with Gorbachev.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was distrustful of Schultz.
Okay. He had his early letters in '80 about how to staff the campaign are very, very detailed, and he's saying, you want to put this guy here, but not here, because he's a good manager, but he's going to sabotage you.
That's staffing the administration.
The administration, the first administration.
Yeah.
And he's very sensitive to Reagan's ideological crusade, which I didn't know because Nixon is so misrepresented in the media that it's basically you have to go on your own mission to find the real Richard Nixon. But he's not he's not commonly depicted as somebody who shared Reagan's ideological principles. But in his letters, he seems to be very sensitive to supporting,
because he's realistic.
Because that's who Reagan is, and
but Nixon is realistic.
Right.
Realistic about Reagan.
Right. Because he felt like this is what he should be doing.
Right.
Is what he's been doing for 20 years. Do you feel that? Do you regret that Nixon resigned? And
oh, of course.
Yeah. I mean, do you wish he hadn't? Do you wish he hadn't decided to resign? Do you wish that he fought it more?
You didn't see my op-ed.
In
the last week's journal?
Nixon Shouldn't Have Resigned by Kenneth L. Khachigian, August 7, 2024, in the Wall Street Journal. Rosemary Woods, President Richard Nixon's personal secretary, told me, "Your memo is good." But it was clear Nixon would never see my 11th hour plea for him not to resign. It was August 8, 1974. And she was already tearfully typing his resignation letter. I was a 29-year-old aide futilely counseling the president that because impeachment pressures were magnified by the day's passions, he needed to pursue his constitutional defenses and force the House and Senate to take a principled stand. As a central player in the administration's anti-impeachment work group, I had been ready for the fray when on the afternoon of August 5, Chief of Staff Al Haig brought our team together, reporting a problem with one tape recording. In the moment's frenzy, we tragically misread that June 23, 1972 conversation between Nixon and then Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman about Haldeman deterring the FBI from probing campaign funds channeled through Mexico as a smoking gun. Even John Dean, who had cooperated with prosecutors and Senate investigators as White House counsel, has since acknowledged that the smoking gun was shooting blanks, that Nixon and Haldeman only sought to protect anonymous campaign contributions the Justice Department already agreed were outside the scope of the FBI's Watergate break-in investigation. Working under intense operating pressures and lacking accurate analysis, our team took a vote tally, and with me as the lone holdout, counseled resignation. If we hadn't rashly misinterpreted the tape and released it that afternoon, Nixon might have survived to fight another day. What have I learned in the 50 years since? Although we are a long way from the summer of 1974, the Watergate pieties haven't changed, and the media retrospectives this week will likely be repeating all the cliches about saving America. The system worked. No man is above the law. But a genuine retrospective of Nixon and Watergate needs to be shorn of cant and caricatures, unburdened by the clockwork bromides of crook and resigned in disgrace. I hope new generations are open to some different thinking, or at least a balanced treatment that goes beyond the story of bungling burglars and political damage control. It must include how the Watergate affair was also the culmination of Nixon's political opponents' long-yeared-for goal of destroying him. Nixon had a political target on his back from his congressional days of vanquishing the communist Alger Hiss, a favorite of Washington's intellectual left. Throughout his entire presidency, Congress was controlled by opposition Democrats, with confrontation aggravated further by Nixon's determination to end the Vietnam War he had inherited from the Kennedy and Johnson administration planners at the State and Defense Departments. Senator Edward Kennedy set up the Senate Watergate Committee. 3 months later, John F. Kennedy's 1960 campaign director of opposition research against Nixon, Archibald Cox, was hired as Watergate's special prosecutor with a staff seeded from the ranks of Robert F. Kennedy's Justice Department. The subsequent special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, expressed concern in an internal memo that his chief deputy reflected, quote, "an attitude I discussed with you before, the subjective conviction that the president must be reached at all cost." Watergate scholar Jeff Shepard has unearthed further damning evidence that the special prosecutors had several unethical private meetings with Judge John Sirica in the absence of attorneys for Nixon and Watergate defendants, each violating the most basic legal protections. Nixon's adversaries weren't looking only for the truth. They were looking for a scalp. I have also come to believe that there is an unacknowledged motive for the unceasing demonization of Nixon and Watergate. If the Washington culture of elite media and the political left can successfully define Nixon as the pinnacle of deceit and dishonesty, then their own immorality, corruption, and abuse of power will seem trivial by comparison. By portraying Nixon as the ultimate sinner, they might make their own governmental and institutional malefaction appear less repugnant. A convenient salve for the sanctimonious voices heard this week. The good news for Nixon is that the worst has been said. His antagonists are left with no rungs to climb on their ladder of hatred. On the other hand, records continue to unfold in the archives of the misconduct among his pursuers. Time and history are on Nixon's side. On May 4, 1977, Nixon phoned in to the viewing party in my home where his former staff had gathered to watch the David Frost Watergate interviews. After surveying our opinions on how the program went, he concluded, "There's nothing we can do about it now. Watergate is there. So be it. I'm not just going to go away like a lot of them would like me to do." And he didn't. He wrote 9 best-selling books and collaborated with me in the 1980 and 84 presidential campaigns to provide private and unofficial advice to Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton has acknowledged that Nixon provided welcome advice during his presidency. Nixon traveled the world and doted on his grandchildren, and he and Pat Nixon saved the U.S. government millions of dollars by relinquishing their Secret Service protection to pay for their own personal aids. I still believe he shouldn't have resigned. If we knew then what we know now, and we had more resources, access to social media, and a better defense, the president may have served out his second term. Yet he spared America the agony caused by the hysteria of the times. Richard Nixon didn't resign in disgrace. He resigned in dignity.
Hey, everybody, have you heard the news? The folks at the White House got the Watergate blues. Don't do us wrong. If you do, don't make no mistake. Cause we'll blow the whistle on you, just like we did to Watergate. God walking the beat, checking all the doors. Found a little piece of tape. Now the whole world knows. Don't do us wrong. If you do, don't make no mistake. Cause we'll blow the whistle on you. Just like we did the Watergate.
Public sentiment, especially given what's been happening to Trump over the last 8 years, which I won't detail now, but those who know. Public sentiment has, in certain circles, has changed a great deal about Richard Nixon. There's a great feeling that Richard Nixon was a victim, not a culprit,
Right.
And so that's why I think that knowing what we now know about what the intelligence operatives will do in collaboration with people like Carl Bernstein, who's been trotted out in the last 8 years to sell every single hoax against Donald Trump. There's a sense that Nixon.
You're talking about Woodward, not Bernstein.
They've been both.
Yeah, they've been both.
They've been both trotted out. Yeah. I have a.
Woodward writes the books.
He writes the books. Bernstein goes on MSNBC and stuff. There's a sense that whole thing was a complete cook job, and I guess you agree with that.
Yeah.
Why didn't he?
He lost his political support.
Okay, he just couldn't. You think he couldn't have received?
He felt he lost his political support, and so without the political support, there was nothing. There was nothing. That was the basic reason, and I think internally he felt that the staff had no stomach for the fight, and I don't think he ever said that. I wish I could go back now and ask him that question. Did you feel like your staff let you down? Because even the tough guys like Buchanan finally say pack it in, and but I was the lone holdout, but I was just a 29-year-old. Even though I was on the anti-impeachment team, as you could tell in the book, but I was pretty much the lone holdout of all those sitting in that room that night when that tape came out, which has since been debunked.
Right.
It's no longer a smoking gun. So
yeah, the smoking gun, which is one of the most. Smoking gun has become
It's a misinterpreted tape.
Yeah, it's a misinterpreted tape, and I think that people who are clear-eyed about the nature of the government now would side with Nixon.
Yeah.
On both sides.
You should read Jeff Shepard's books about this and his writings.
Oh, I will. The theme recurs, though, that there is a careerist staff that is concerned about its contacts in Washington and its future jobs and gigs, and they, in the Reagan administration and the Nixon administration and the Trump administration and all these administrations.
Well, sure. Okay, you look at Gergen. He ended up working for Clinton. You look at Duberstein. He ended up endorsing Obama and lived a life as a lobbyist. And all of it. Basically, John Ehrlichman described it perfectly. He said, the problem is they come to Washington, then they go off and marry the natives. and it's true. Even the congressmen, they come to Washington, and then they retire and they stay in Washington.
Right. They
don't go back to their homes. That's very rare. Dick Cheney's a rarity. He's back in Wyoming. But it's like this guy on TV all the time, the former Utah congressman. It's on Fox. Got the kinky hair. I can't remember his name now. He's a spokesman on Fox, on cable. He was a congressman from Utah. He was in Congress for 6, 8, 10 years. I don't know how long. He retires and stays in Washington.
Right.
And maybe keeps a home in Utah that goes back for Christmas and skiing or something like that, and that's it. But they get stuck. And even Newt Gingrich is a perfect example. Although he does make a big, he makes a difference. He makes a contribution, but that's kind of rare. Most of them, come back either lobby they're hangers-on, and it's chapter 16 of my book. It's the power players. It's hungry for power, hungry for attention. It's the elixir, the aphrodisiac and it's the allure of wanting to be in. And I confess it's very nice. It's wonderful. But
you resisted it overtly. You avoided becoming a full-time staffer.
And I confess missing it a lot, but I prefer not to have to suck up to it.
Right. Do you have any about, like, there was with Nixon? You give kind of, the book begins with the resignation, the anti-impeachment team resignation talks, the backroom discussions of all this and what he was going to say, and then your preparation of the Frost Nixon interviews, where you were heavily involved in the long prep, and that was a very dramatic kind of chance for Nixon to not redeem himself, but at least hold it seemed like hold the line a little bit on his reputation, and I think you feel. My sense of it is that you feel that he ultimately succeeded in doing that. In the Frost Nixon.
Yeah, he put it behind him.
He put it behind him,
even though he didn't want to do it the way he did it.
Right, but there's a huge drama in there over whether he admits that he's going to admit that he lied, and he absolutely did not want to admit that he lied. And I think he was right about that, not to admit that he lied, because, as we can see through history, but also strategically.
He said I misled him on the small things, but on the big things I told the truth, is the way he put it.
Right.
And but the way he eventually put it, he said, and then he said at the party we had when we watched the Frost Watergate portion of the interviews, he said, "Well, it's behind us now. We had to do it. And if I didn't do it, I'd be dead as Kelsey's nuts." Whatever that means, I don't even know what that means.
It doesn't need to mean that much. I mean, just like when he said that Texas is going to be tough titty.
Yeah.
one of his.
That's Conley said that. Yeah.
Oh, but again, the staff was minus you. The staff was pushing him to say he lied.
Well,
because it was more convenient for their.
Diane Sawyer and Frank Gannon. Yeah.
Right, and Diane Sawyer also kind of railroaded him in one moment. You don't say that, you say not intentionally, but where she had in the prep for the interview, left out a huge.
Yeah, I think I don't know if that was intentional or just by oversight.
Right. In the book, you don't claim it's intentional, but I always wonder.
I think it could have been by oversight. Right. There was so much material that. I mean, there were just huge volumes of material, and I should have remembered it too. I just that Walters had said, don't run afoul of CIA operations, and but maybe it's something she should have remembered as well. But I don't. She was loyal to him. I don't ever question her loyalty. She was, but she didn't want him to. She and Gannon, were, they were cohabiting, and I mean, that wasn't a secret or anything. And they had the same sort of viewpoint on this issue, and they just they felt more strongly about it than I did. I mean, Gannon was even stronger. He felt that he should consent to committing a crime, which I thought was nuts.
Horrible advice.
Yeah.
It's horrible advice.
To advise your boss to say I committed a crime, yeah. I don't know what he was thinking. That's why I expose that in the book. It's
well, it seems to me like it's this Washington staffitis condition that it repeats itself throughout. It's the type of thing that would make their careers easier to be involved. To have been the one to get the president to admit that he lied, and so that they don't they're not tarnished.
That's a perceptive observation.
I mean, it's a exasperated one. You were mentored by Pat Buchanan,
Right.
Which he comes off as, you don't write too much about him because he's only here in the beginning, in the Nixon parts.
Yeah.
Then he disappears, although he's one of the fascinating characters. He's one of the few Washington characters that one can't help but like.
Right.
He seems so charming. He was obviously a major media star, and everyone
loved
him. But tell me a little bit about your relationship with him. How did he become your mentor? How did he how did he become attracted to you?
I mean, he's the one that brought me on, obviously.
That was which year?
In '60, I wrote the letter to Nixon in '67, and then January of '68, I came in for the interview with Pat. Mm-hmm. So he's the one that brought me in. And then I probably bump into him a few times. And then because he was a contact, I used to send information into him on the campaign, but I wasn't that close to him. But then he was one of the few people that would pay attention to me when I was desperate to get a job at the White House, and he helped engineer get me in contact with people to get me a job at the White House finally, when I was having trouble getting in. And then whenever I needed some help getting anything through, Pat would help me. And then finally, I ended up working for him in '71, from spring of '71 all the way through the '72 campaign, on political matters. And then I can't remember when I couldn't give you a date when they moved me around so many offices, but at some point I moved in to share a suite with him. So I was like here, and he had a big office, and then there was a shared secretarial space in between, and I had the office across the hall across the secretarial pool. Mm-hmm. And we shared that area from probably late '72 to right through resignation, and then we weren't on the same social. He had a social group that he belonged to that was different than mine, but still he and Shelley periodically, we had them out to visit us, and he was always accessible to me, and he was loyal to the extent that he, when we worked together, he would add my name on memos to the president periodically, and which was something others wouldn't do to their subordinates. So he gave me, if I provided I would draft memos, and then he would rewrite them and stuff, but he would include me on the letterhead.
So he was clearly not stingy about credit.
No, exactly. No, he wasn't built that way. So he gave me credit where credit was due, and we just became pals all forever, and we remained so. I just talked to him a few weeks ago and a couple of months ago, or 4th of July.
How's he doing? We don't see him in public anymore.
He's okay.
Yeah. What did he see in you that?
I don't know. Jarbig.
Jarbig. And he's the one who gave you the nickname
Onoda.
Onoda, which is named after the Japanese soldier who was fighting World War II into the 70s.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. He still calls me that.
Onoda does? That's so cute.
Just to alert you, I have a 4 o'clock TV.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Video Zoom call.
Oh, okay, yeah, understood.
That's probably a spam call.
Yeah, well, I get about
it's spam.
20 of them a day.
Yeah.
What made you? Let's go to the roots a little bit. What made you first of all get into politics? Did you first get into politics, or did you first get into writing?
No, politics. Probably there was something called Boys State. I don't know if you know about it. If you don't, you should look it up. Boys State was sponsored by the American Legion in, I don't know when it started, probably in the 50s. And it went, I don't know how long it went, but you can look it up, Google it. Boys State, Bill Clinton went to Boys State. And then he actually went to Boys Nation. They picked 2 people from Boys State to go to Boys Nation from each state. And Boys State was like an experiment in actual government that 2 went from each high school to the state capitol. And so you got it. It's like you actually got into you actually ran campaigns and stuff like that. And I ran for a statewide campaign in Boys State and won. And so I liked the idea of campaigning and everything. And then I ran for office in high school, junior, senior. Sophomore, junior, senior class president, and I was always involved in student government. I was student body president in college. And
is there an sense of athletic competition that appealed to you about running?
Probably. I was very competitive, yeah, and still am, and so it's. And then when I ran into Nixon in '62, he was campaigning for governor at Santa Barbara, and my one guy in my dormitory was a Nixon fan, and he was on the debate team with me and my roommate, and we went to the high school to see Nixon speak, and then we sort of cornered him afterwards, and this pal that was in my dorm gave me 6 Crises, and I read 6 Crises, and was sort of captivated by it. And then so I followed politics really carefully. And in 1966, like when the midterm elections came, I went down to ABC News in New York and said, back then they didn't have all the electronics and everything. They did everything manually. Mm-hmm. And so they needed people to put put the scores on the board and everything else. And so they needed like interns, and so I think I still have my credentials. So I said, I'd like to volunteer at election night.
You operated the election night scoreboard.
Yeah, and to help them with it and give them ideas on stuff like that. So I went down and I got a job election night working with ABC News, National.
And that's 1966.
Yeah, and so I was always, looking for ways to get involved. And then '67 came around, and nobody was interested in Nixon back then because he was a loser.
Right. Although, again, he conceded what could have easily been a stolen election.
Yeah.
And again, he kind of out of. What are your feelings about that? That he did he probably did the right thing and.
Yeah,
conceding.
Looking back, I guess. But once again, having read about it and studied it, I think he got screwed.
Right.
And I think it's just like Watergate. It's the establishment worked against him, and they said, well, we don't like this guy, and we like the other guy better, and so we're not gonna take up his cause.
Right.
And they obviously preferred Kennedy, so it wasn't a cause that the Washington Post and the New York Times and the networks were going to take up.
Sounds familiar.
There was going to be no investigative reporting of any substance, but there's been books written about it, and they've proven that Lyndon Johnson stole his Senate campaign in '48, and they've shown how elections are stolen in Texas. So Texas arguably was stolen easily, and
Illinois
was likely stolen, and so it's and that was classic Kennedy stuff. Exactly what he did in the primaries with against Humphrey, and so it was. But Nixon was, to that extent, he was not used to playing hardball, and that's probably why things got carried away in '72 to some extent.
Right. There's that recurring theme where kind of all the pressure is against one kind of standing up for oneself.
Yeah.
Against the establishment.
Yeah.
And when one does stand up for oneself, all hell breaks loose. And, as we can see. So, what was Santa Barbara? I went to UC Santa Barbara as well for 2 years. And what was it like in the 60s? What was
there was only 4,000 students when I started.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It was pretty cool.
Like a tiny private school.
Yeah. It was pretty nice. It was 9,000 when I left, but I lived in the barracks my first year, and it was just a really small campus. And
did the hippies did it become hippie-ish in the 60s or later?
No, it just maybe starting in my last year, '66. I had. One of the guys, Dennis Dutton, the guy who ran KCBS then, he tried to, just my senior year, he tried to convince me to use LSD, and he said, Ken, it's a profoundly religious experience. But that was very, very unique.
It wasn't going around.
It wasn't going around, and there weren't guys with long hair running around, and this was, I think, what year was the Grateful Dead playing at the Mud Hole. I'm drawing a blank, and in New York.
Oh yes. I'm not sure it was 65 or 66.
No, it was after that.
It was after
69, I think. Anyway, whatever it was. We didn't have any of that. And the bank burning was after in '70, I think, and so it was.
Oh, you mean Woodstock, Grateful Dead?
Woodstock, yeah, yeah,
right. 69.
69, yeah, okay.
Pretty sure, yeah.
So we weren't.
It hadn't arrived west.
No, and it was it was pretty plain vanilla campus, and it was fun. I had a great time. It was some of the best years of my life.
It's a beautiful, beautiful place.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful place.
Yeah,
and you came from you're basically a farm boy from
Vicea,
born to survivors of the Armenian genocide.
My dad,
Your dad,
not my mom, but my dad.
And do you think there was any connect? I mean, I don't want to force an answer that's not accurate, because I'm sure every single Armenian who's talked to you about this over the decades asks you about this. But nevertheless, I wonder if you see any kind of connection between that heritage and your ultimate desire to get into political combat.
No, it hasn't driven me.
Yeah,
in that sense.
What were your strongest influences as a writer, just from a purely literary standpoint?
I can't say that I have any. I don't have any great. To that degree, I don't have any people I can turn to and say, that I can't say like John Dos Passos
right.
influenced me, or William Freud influenced me, or something like that. I can't even tell you that there's any great writers that I love great writing, but I don't. There's not any great works that I can turn to and say, I'm not. I didn't read poetry a lot.
Did you ever hear a presidential speech and think, "Oh, that was good," or something? Did you ever hear? Was there some sort of rhetoric flying in the air that kind of?
No, I'm sort of self-taught, I guess. I guess, I loved William Buckley's writings. I read National Review a lot, and I read a lot of those guys back in the day, but.
Did you have a relationship with Buckley?
No, I didn't. I introduced him at UCSB when he spoke. As a student by president, I got to introduce all the celebrities, including Reagan.
Right.
Reagan and Buckley and James Farmer, the civil rights guy, and a couple others. I don't know who all. I've got Buckley's autograph on my introduction of him. I didn't think to get Reagan's, but I still have the copy of my introduction of all of them. My files. I'm a pack rat. But no, I didn't. It's like Buchanan, and Buchanan is just the opposite. Buchanan is extremely literary. He can quote authors and poet. He read a lot of poetry, Ezra Pound and others, and he's extremely. I just admire him. There's people that are 10 times better writers than I am, and I struggle with it.
What was your first big hit in terms of a line or a phrase or something that you feel like gave you the sense that you're onto something as a speechwriter? Do you recall whether it was in the Nixon years, whenever? Was there like a?
Let's see. I don't know. It was probably a speech. I didn't get to write big speeches for Nixon because I was. It was probably one I did with Nixon in Spokane. I can't remember. It was so big I can't even remember what it was now. But it got some attention. And but all my first big lines came with Reagan in the campaign, and they're mentioned in the book.
Right.
Any of those that made it on the evening news are the ones that, and that one that Robert Novak quoted that.
Robert Novak was a booster of yours, basically.
Yeah, he was.
I liked Robert Novak a lot.
He and I became very close friends.
I read his memoir. I didn't really know anything about him except that he was a conservative who was a reporter. But then when he released his memoir,
He converted to Catholicism.
But his memoir was very honest. Mm-hmm. And for a Washington D.C. memoir, it seemed quite rare. Mm-hmm. And I admired him after reading it. He seemed. I could discuss your relationship with him. He seemed very. He was always adamant about crediting you for the big Reagan lines, speeches that were successful. In his column was the most important column in Washington.
He could move. He was a mover and shaker, and he'd slice your throat open from here to here, and go to and not lose a bit of sleep at night.
Right. Why do you think how did he avoid the DC bug why do you think he was so special, basically, and you knew him well?
I don't know. I don't know his background. I don't know how he was raised. I don't know what his upbringing was like. His son is the publisher. Brought me in, but Bob was. He was not. You never joked around with him. I mean, never. He was not He wasn't a laugh a minute guy. And anytime all our lunches were all just bullshit about politics and what was going gossip, political gossip. And I want to know what was going on in Washington. He wanted to know what was going on in California. Never took notes.
Interesting.
It was just kept
all in the head.
Kept it all up here.
And accurately.
And accurately.
Yeah.
And there was something about me he just liked. I don't know why. I can't. Maybe we had similar upbringings, and I don't know. It's just, I think he just liked the fact that I helped turn literally helped turn around Reagan's campaign at a critical time, because nobody else was carrying the load.
In 80.
In 80. I mean, everybody else was... I don't say it expressly in the book, but pretty much I was... nobody else was doing the writing.
Right.
Except me. And so...
Do you think Reagan recognized that sufficiently?
Oh, it's clear that he did. Or else he wouldn't have gotten... He didn't let people get close to him that much. No, it's clear that he did, and it's clear that Nancy did. Or else...
Right. Maybe more importantly.
More importantly.
Yeah.
Or else he would have never asked me to do his inaugural.
Right. You paint a very clear picture of Nancy being very involved, sometimes to a frightening degree.
Right. That's right.
Especially, it seems, at the end, when she seemed to bump you off of his farewell address in favor of Peggy Noonan, so that it would be sufficient of vision instead of politics.
Well, and that wasn't up to me. It was the president's.
Right.
That was the president's call, not mine.
But but was it his call or her call? Was the question? It's a sort of ambiguous. At the end.
No, I mean it was his. The decision on the speech was his call, not mine.
Right.
At the end of the day, and they were, as I made clear, in terms of describing the lunch we had at the ranch,
where
they were going back and forth over what the speech should be like.
Yeah.
And she was expressing to him the sense that I need to be in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And he kept saying, "Well, you got to have facts. You got to have facts." And basically,
facts, not platitudes.
Yeah, facts, not platitudes. And she just wanted him to go up there and talk about Shining City on the Hill.
Yeah. And
she didn't want him to be Mr. Tough Guy. She just wanted everybody to adore him, and throw flowers at his feet. And as I say in the book, he got tired of being kicked around by the Democrats at their convention, and there was that side to him that was competitive, and
you identified that one of the underrated things, or maybe unrecognized things about him, is that when he felt like he was being what's the word I'm looking for, sort of defied or counted out in some way, he as he was with the Bitburg speech, which Nancy did not want him to give the speech at Bitburg, and all the Jews got mad, and everyone got mad that he was going to go speak at Bitburg in 1984 or 5? 85. And he absolutely refused to cancel that trip.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most interesting parts of dramatic parts of the presidency, which probably people don't even register in the 8 years. The speech at Bitburg, and you helped him with that speech considerably.
I wrote it.
You wrote the speech.
He changed 3 words.
And that speech got you an offer to become the rabbi of Brooklyn.
By Abraham Hoffman. If the price was right.
If the price was right. That was that letter, which that's like a Jewish joke. It's like a classic old, if the price is right.
Think how far we've come from that time when despair made these tragic victims wonder if anything could survive. As we flew here from Hanover, low over the greening farms and the emerging springtime of the lovely German countryside, I reflected, and there must have been a time when the prisoners at Berger-Belsen and those of every other camp must have felt the springtime was gone forever from their lives. Surely we can understand that when we see what is around us. All these children of God, under bleak and lifeless mounds, the plainness of which does not even hint at the unspeakable acts that created them. Here they lie, never to hope, never to pray, never to love, never to heal, never to laugh, never to cry. And too many of them knew that this was their fate. But that was not the end.
So yeah, he assumed that your knowledge of Judaica, as he put it, must mean that you're.
Well, I got another thing through my website from a guy who read the book, a Jewish guy from Washington read the book, and said that I must have rabbinical training because I mentioned the Talmud in that chapter, and that I must have studied the Talmud, and went on, and I must have been rabbinical training.
Well, you could have had an alternate career.
Yeah.
If only. Are there any qualities other than this that you of Ronald Reagan? We talk. His aloofness is somewhat well known. Well, I mean, people recognize that he was somewhat aloof. Well, first of all, do you think that do you think that the Alzheimer's was earlier than?
No.
No, that's a fake. That's a fault because people throw that.
He was okay all the way through.
And do you feel that he himself was satisfied with his presidency? I mean, obviously the achievements are everyone in due time.
I don't think you fully know the answer to that. He was happy to be back on the ranch. He did feel that the biggest mistake was not the biggest, but one of his biggest mistakes was caving in on the 82 tax cut.
TEFRA.
Right. TEFRA, the tax increase.
The tax increase, yeah.
He felt that was one of the biggest mistakes of his presidency.
And you felt that you could have. I believe that was one of the cases where you felt
and I caved in.
You caved
just like Lynn Nofziger did and Marty Anderson did when he kept calling us all in and saying, you got to be part of the team. And this is after he had given all that big lecture about Maggie Thatcher making the mistake by raising taxes, and then Baker and the others all convinced him, you need to do this, and so then he convinced himself that he had to do it, and that these weren't really taxes; these were just raising excise taxes, and that he was going to get $3 of budget cuts for every dollar in revenue increase, and then up at the ranch, he's complaining to me, and not just the ranch, he complained to me more than once. They lied to me. He says, we got, for every dollar of tax increase, we got $1.72 of revenue increase. And just the opposite of what,
spending increase.
Spending increase.
Right, spending. It was supposed to be spending cut of $3 for every dollar of the tax increase. It turned out to be an opposite.
$1.72 of budget increase.
Instead of
for
decrease.
every dollar of tax increase. So it was just way totally reverse, and he felt that he got it, had the rug pulled out from him under him. Well, and then I quote Baker in his oral history saying, "Well, we probably could have worked out anyway without doing the tax increase."
Yeah. Well,
they caught him in his own game.
Right. This is, people forget that Reagan had to contend with a Democrat Congress throughout his campaign, except for.
Well, he had a Republican Senate.
Right.
He didn't have a Democrat Senate.
Yeah, but his
battles. But he had the ability to communicate.
Right.
That was
his strength.
Was his strength, and he could have taken it to the country.
And he could also, you paint also how in those early months, those early meetings, his ability to communicate was also instrumental to his own cabinet, not merely the public, but in terms of coaching his own people, boosting him with the confidence to forge ahead with the cuts and with the streamlining.
He just needed to, but he, by that time they convinced him not to be aggressive and tough, and then, he just became more malleable and more amenable, and he, within the ranks, and then they convinced Meese to turn around too.
Ed Meese. Yeah. Do you feel that there's a quality about Reagan that the public doesn't really know that that they should? That because he's spoken of so often, there are a lot of hagiographies about him. There are a lot of hit pieces about him ever since. Is there something you think that no one ever really saw, or was he a purely public man, the ultimate purely?
I don't try to do psycho at either Nixon or Reagan. I never engage in that. I think all the cable people who do that are
Well, I think there's a whole cottage industry.
Yeah,
saying,
there's a
what would Reagan do? And I don't ask those questions either. What they would do, but I'm curious if there was something they did that people don't know about because I was behind closed doors.
I mean, I know what he told me, and I know what he said to me, and I know what his thinking was on a lot of things, but then I don't know, how he, when I get asked what would he do, how would he react, and everything else. But he did change his mind on things, and I just think that a lot of times people get tired of fighting the fight, and there were times he just preferred to go ride his horse and up at Camp David and cut wood at the ranch.
And the Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that was a reflection of his age, too, because sometimes people, if the 1960s Reagan may not have given in on Tefra, it's the same.
He gave in on a lot of things as governor, too.
Well, people blame him now. I think they blame for California being blue, for the amnesty in the 80s and so forth. And I think that's I don't know if you have a take on that, whether he's responsible for that or whether that was really just, the Democrat Congress.
I really haven't studied that. Some parts I credit that. We had a woman working for us, Gina, that was given amnesty, and it worked out for her, and she made a new life for herself, and she was grateful, and it probably a lot of Armenians got amnesty too, and created a life for them. So, but then it was 2 million people. Now there's 11 or 12 million people. It's a whole different deal.
You have a chapter in here about describing the moments following the shooting and the day of the shooting, which you very easily could have been present for and in the line of fire.
That's
when
right.
Reagan was shot.
Yeah.
You described how his recovery and the big moments following were used to push forward with his tax cuts. You decided to use it politically.
Right.
Well, let me just ask you, how did you feel a few weeks ago when the news hit that Trump was shot?
Well, there was some deja vu. It wasn't the same because immediately you saw it wasn't a death. It wasn't a potentially fatal shot.
Right.
And of course, right away he's putting his arm up there and fight, and then putting the flag behind them, and they're putting out T-shirts and everything. Right. So it's sort of different. I mean, Reagan was in critical condition, and the tracheal tube down his mouth, and the world wondering what was going on, and whether he came within a 50-50 chance, I guess, and losing a lot of blood and everything else. So it was quite different. It had it been a wound, maybe a head wound, or maybe to the arm, or there'd been a lot different. So it wasn't total deja vu all over the end. And plus, he resisted the Secret Service putting him down and taking him away. He fought, he kept trying to elevate himself, and which put him at risk and everybody else at more risk. And, so I don't know. I just didn't have the same feeling that we had sort of the peril that day.
I mean, regardless of the parallels, do you feel what did you feel as a citizen, seeing that happen in the year 2024 in the midst of it?
Well, I wasn't surprised. I just I always feel that somebody's going to. I keep thinking somebody's going to take a shot at somebody. And I'm surprised somebody didn't take a shot at Putin or Zelensky. And
why? Do you think that the security overall has been improved over the decades?
Yeah, well, it's. I'm sure it's vastly improved. It's just. I'm just always surprised there hasn't been somebody on the inside or something like that, especially in Russia or Ukraine. Some traitors.
Yeah. Do you feel that if you were to guess, and I know this is a purely recreational question, would you feel that this shooting was more than it seems?
No.
You think it was
just a wacko.
Random wacko.
I don't see conspiracies.
Right.
I'm not much of a conspiracy guy, but I think this guy's just a whack job. It's death by suicide, or suicide by cop, or what do they call it? Just it's they'll keep looking for motives and everything else, and they probably won't find any.
Well, there's no mystery in people having been radicalized to want to take out Donald Trump. That's the most. It was the most predictable thing. I mean, that there would be many of these people.
Well, out of 340,000 people in the country, I mean, certainly there's an volatile hatred aimed at people. I mean, there's a lot of people. I mean, I wake up in the morning saying, on the other side of the aisle, saying, I hate that asshole, but I never hate him enough to want to shoot him or kill him.
My final question is simply this: to what degree, as I'm reading your history, I see that so much of governance.
I'm just going to move these chairs.
Oh yes,
go ahead.
I get the feeling that, especially with Reagan, in the Reagan administration, and with how much of his job was simply communicating, and how much of the job, speechwriting is more than just speechwriting. It's like it seems to be a significant chunk of the actual governance of the country. Have you reflected on the way that? Okay, let me help you.
No.
Have you reflected on how powerful basically you were in being able to, just with a few words, change history? I mean, it's not just rhetoric to get elected, but it seems like it affected, basically, a few words could affect everything in the government, the entire disposition of the people, the economy, which is a reflection of people, of the psychology of the people, as much as it is a reflection of
I think
resources.
People attribute to me more than I do. Someday I might sit back and think, wow, man, I had a real impact on everything. I'll have to have too many scotches to do that.
Well, maybe that'll be the secret next time. Well, related to that, the final question. The big difference between now and the 80s is that there's social media, and that the messaging is at a pace of 1 million times what it was then. You could come up with a line then that people would talk about for weeks and months and even years. But now there's lines coming from every direction, flying at everyone's faces. Have you felt the nature of propaganda and political rhetoric to have changed fundamentally because of this? I mean, have you thought about, has that thought occurred to you at all, and in what ways?
No, the basics of messaging haven't changed. Good messaging is good messaging.
And that's good messaging is image?
No, just words that penetrate and move people's, that can have people do things, make them change their minds.
We're told that on his body was found a diary. On the flyleaf, under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone. The crisis we're facing today does not require of us the kind of sacrifice that Martin Treptow and so many thousands of others were called upon to make. It does require, however, our best effort and our willingness to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds, to believe that together, with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans.
This episode of Filthy Meanian Adventures was recorded live in San Juan Capistrano, California, guest starring Ken Khachigian, author of Behind Closed Doors, available in bookstores everywhere. Check out his website, nixonandreagan.com. This episode is brought to you by the Rug Merchants, Cigar Singers, and Onodas of the Night, who subscribe to the show on Patreon. To join their elite society, become a patron at patreon.com/filthyarmenian. It's morning in America. You ain't seen nothing yet. And to be continued.
Underneath the western sky. On my cayuse, let me wander over yonder till I see the mountains rise. I want to ride to the ridge where the west commences. Gaze at the moon till I lose my senses. Can't stand hobbles and I can't stand fences. Don't fence me in. Don't fence me in. Don't fence me in. Don't fence me in.